Let's begin this week's discussion of the Byzantine Empire. And what I'd like to do this week in the second of these sessions is to talk about what the title suggests, the growth of the city and the survival of the Eastern Empire. And remember last week I was talking about the progressive disparagement of the term Byzantine Empire. It is a term which I think we should carry on using because everybody understands what it means. At the same time, it is not a particularly accurate title for what we're discussing. What we are discussing is the continuing Roman Empire in its eastern provinces. But if I do keep calling it the Byzantine Empire, that is simply from convenience or from intellectual laziness. Make your own mind up. Whatever the case, let's have a recapitulation of what we discussed last week. Here on the left you have the Foundation of Constantinople by Rubens, rather a fine painting, and this represents the legend of the city's foundation. When Constantine became the supreme master of the Mediterranean world, he looked at the changed circumstances of the empire that he had taken over, and he realized what Diocletian before him had known, that Rome was no longer in the right place. The empire could no longer be regarded as the city of Rome plus appendages. The empire itself could no longer be regarded as a purely Mediterranean entity centred on Italy. The empire was surrounded by frontiers which were now under continual pressure. There were the Rhine and Danube frontiers, and there was the Euphrates frontier. It was necessary to be near to all of those frontiers and to have a much more mobile position than having a capital in Rome would allow. At the same time, the balance of population and wealth in the empire was, it seems, overwhelmingly in the east. And a third point to consider is that Constantine, as a Christian emperor, as the first Christian emperor, wanted to make a straightforward statement of purpose, which was that this would be a new empire, and giving himself a new capital would do that. He decided on the ancient city of Byzantium as the location for his new capital. A very fine location, a location, however, which had never been fully realized before. In a sense, Constantine was not a revolutionary. Diocletian, his predecessor, had also moved his working capital to the east, to Nicomedia, just across the water from Byzantium. There were very few breaks with the past as established by Diocletian. Constantine kept the administrative reforms. The empire remained divided into semi-autonomous zones. There were, of course, two emperors, one in the east, one in the west, but there was a great deal now of decentralization. He continued, though he slightly revised, the gold coinage of Diocletian, but he seems to have changed this not with any thoughts of a further inflation in mind, but simply because it made for a more user-friendly gold coinage. Whatever the case, the standard that he set would remain untouched for most of the next 800 years. He continued the new taxation policy, and although this taxation policy has attracted rather unpleasant comments in the historical literature, it does seem to have been the empire's first serious attempt at a uniform taxation policy. Before then, the provinces paid various kinds of tribute to the capital, and there was nothing approaching an imperial budget. Now the taxes were harmonized throughout the empire. Rome and Italy lost their ancient privileges. The largest taxpayers in the empire, who tended not to be the best connected in the political sense, found that their own overall tax burden came down, whereas the burden on the possessing classes became considerably heavier. With this new, strengthened imperial state, Constantine and before him Diocletian were able to secure all the borders of the empire. There had been a first-class set of military crises in the 3rd century when almost every frontier had collapsed. We must accept that these military crises were brought to a definitive end before the end of the 3rd century by Diocletian, and that by the time Constantine was the undisputed emperor, the borders were entirely secure, and they had been entirely secure for well over a generation, and they would continue on the whole to be entirely secure for a very long time to come. The crises of the 3rd century were not the beginning of the end. They were a set of crises, and that is all. The crises were overcome. The radical change, of course, that Constantine made was the establishment of Christianity as the preferred faith of the empire. Until the beginning of the 4th century, the church was a despised and persecuted sect. The bishops and priests were in permanent danger of arrest and execution, and suddenly, at the stroke of a pen almost, the church was transformed into the official faith of the empire, and the bishops were co-opted into the imperial ruling class, complete with various tax and legal privileges. You also have the building of immense new churches throughout the empire, new churches in every city in the empire, built at taxpayer expense. You have St. Peter's in Rome, which was completely rebuilt in the 16th century, though you can still see the foundations of Constantine's church in the crypt. And here is the church of St. Irene in Constantinople. This was built by Constantine, and that is still standing, and it's a fine structure. You have a number of other churches in Rome, many of them still standing. Let's have a look at this one. This is not a Constantine church, but it's the interior of St. Paul outside the walls. It's in Rome, and it was begun in 386. Many years ago, when my wife and I first went to Rome, we started by looking at all of the usual things: the Colosseum, the Forum, the Temple of Jupiter. We found that there's only so much charm in looking at ruins. And first of all, we found ourselves in the Pantheon, which is a temple which was converted into a church. And then we began looking at the earliest churches. And there's quite a few of these that date from the 4th century. These are completely Roman buildings. These are in the style of Roman public buildings of the age. They're still standing, and they're often pretty well unchanged from when they were first built, and they give you a much better idea of Roman public architecture in the 4th and 5th centuries than any number of ruins. Indeed, it's rather interesting because sometimes you need to walk down flights of steps to get to the churches, which shows you how high the street level has risen in Rome since the 4th and 5th centuries. Something else that Constantine did was to commission 300 Bibles for placing in his new churches. And there is a page from the Codex Sinaiticus which is in the British Museum. Paganism was not outlawed. Constantine maintained complete religious toleration, except of course that blood sacrifices were made illegal and various other things. Temple prostitution, for example, was suppressed, but paganism itself as a set of alternative religions, these remained entirely legal. The main revolution was in personnel, not in law. I said last week that there was now a settled preference in the administration at every level through the empire, a settled preference for Christian recruits. And of course, if the best way to get a job in the administration is to be a Christian, then the number of Christians will expand, won't it? The moment it was established, the church, which was already a substantial presence in all the cities of at least the Eastern Empire, saw a greater expansion of numbers. It's very hard to say when any kind of tipping point was reached, but it was a smooth and steady and often silent progress from 313 to, shall we say, 391, when paganism was legally suppressed, from establishment of what was surely still a minority faith to the point where Christianity has become the majority faith in the empire, at least the majority faith in the cities, and you can then talk about a Christian empire. It is possible to see Constantine's establishment of Christianity as an entirely cynical step. He needed a unifying faith for his empire, and Christianity was probably the best on offer. The deal in his mind may have been that he would establish the church, the bishops would receive certain privileges, and the churches would be built all over the place. In return for that, the bishops and the priests would preach unlimited obedience to Constantine and his heirs and successors by law appointed, etc., and that would be the deal. The church would get toleration, the church would get privilege. In return for that, it would strengthen the hand of the government. If that was on Constantine's mind, he doesn't appear to have got what he wanted, because the establishment of Christianity for the first time created a balanced constitutional state in the Mediterranean world. Let's have a look at these two pictures. Have a look at this one, The Torches of Nero, a fine 19th century painting. Remember how when Rome burned down, suspicion went round that Nero had had a hand in it, and so Nero defended himself by pointing at the Christians and saying they did it. And so all the Christians he could lay hands on were rounded up, and he had them wrapped up and soaked in pitch and used to illuminate one of his dinner parties. And here's a representation of that, and something like this did happen. He did burn many Christians to death in this most revolting spectacle. And the interesting thing is, not that Nero was an evil man, because we can all agree that. The point is that the early emperors could do this. The early emperors, in theory, were simply the first citizens of the state. They were appointed by the Senate. They were ordinary senators who had been raised to an exalted position, and they could be taken down by the Senate if that was felt to be necessary. In practice, the emperors could do anything they wanted. They were absolute arbitrary masters of the whole Mediterranean world. There was nothing that could stand in their way. The only way that you could check an emperor was to assassinate him. It was absolute arbitrary despotism tempered by political assassination. So long as he delivered what he was supposed to deliver, which was minimal peace within the empire and secure frontiers, and as long as he didn't go bankrupt, and as long as he kept control of the army, the emperor could do anything he liked to anyone. There was nowhere to hide. There was no temple that would take you in and give you sanctuary, and that would keep the empire's men from walking in and just grabbing you. However, the moment Christianity is established, remember that the emperor has now taken off his toga and he's cast aside any pretense of just being an ordinary senator who happens to have a number of very important positions. The emperor has now come out of the closet. He is an absolute arbitrary ruler. He dresses in shimmering purple. He wears a crown. He's surrounded by an army of eunuchs and other flunkies, and people can only approach him with bent back. And if you come into his presence, you must throw yourself on the ground and perform a full prostration. Although the emperor has transformed himself outwardly into an absolute despot, he is no longer an absolute despot. That's the irony of this. Have a look at this picture, which is Honorius and his pigeons. And if, like me, you're suffering a pigeon infestation, you will think rather ill of Honorius, but it's a fair representation of one of the 5th century emperors. Look, the emperor, he's not up to much, he's feeding his pigeons, but look, he's being approached by his bishops. Do you think there's anything Honorius can do to these bishops? They're bowing to him. They're showing him all the respect that is due to the secular ruler. But do you think Honorius can point at one of those bishops and say, have that man stripped and flogged? I want him crucified. In fact, I condemn you all to the galleys. Do you think the emperor could do that with these men? And the answer is no. And if you can get these bishops on your side, then there's nothing the emperor can do to you. The actual power of the emperor over the lives, liberties and property of his subjects was, for the first time in Roman history, constrained by the establishment of the church. I won't claim that the church stood up on every occasion for right and justice. I won't say that the church on every occasion took what we would regard as the right side. But if the church collectively, or if even a rather influential functionary within the church were to stand up and say, no, you can't do this, then there was nothing the emperor could do but smile and back down. Indeed, looking a few centuries ahead, one of the Byzantine emperors, for dynastic reasons, needed to marry for a 4th time, which the church on the whole doesn't allow, or the church in those days didn't allow. The emperor had to go to the Patriarch of Constantinople and beg for a dispensation. I am the emperor. For reasons of state, I need to marry a 4th time. Can I do this? The Patriarch said, yes, of course you can. However, you can't marry for a 5th time, and I also rule that this dispensation for you must not be regarded as any kind of precedent for other people. Nero, you may remember, was able to have his favourite boy slave castrated, dressed in women's clothing so that he could marry him. One of his successors in Constantinople had to go almost on bended knees to the priests of the new established faith and ask for a dispensation so that he could marry and beget a son who would continue a stable succession. That is one of the effects of the establishment of Christianity. Yes, that's it. Nero ruled, in theory, as the first citizen of a republic, but was an absolute and arbitrary tyrant. Honorius was the 13th apostle. he was ordained by God, yet his actual power over his subjects was much smaller than the powers that Nero had ever exercised. Something else that Constantine didn't understand was that Christianity was and is a uniquely intellectual religion. At the end of several thousand years, we can say this as a settled fact. It was something only just emerging when Constantine established the faith. Since the 18th century, it has been the fashion to sneer at the Aryan Controversy. Homoousios comes down to a single letter. The two words are identical except that one of them has an iota and the other hasn't. And in Latin, the two positions translate into the same word, consubstantium or consubstantialis. Yes, that's all very well. Even so, the Aryan controversy was of enormous intellectual and political importance. Let's talk about the Aryan controversy, even if just for a little while. And remember that from now on, religion and politics are the same thing. Disputes within the church are also crises for the empire. You have those people who believe that Christ is like the Father. He's infinitely superior to human beings, but he is a created being, and as such he is separate from God and inferior to God. And there are those people who believe that Christ is one with the Father, identical in his substance. You may say, does any of this matter? And perhaps, considered purely in itself, it doesn't matter. It is, I think, an entirely respectable position to say that any religious dispute which is incapable of being understood by persons of ordinary education and intelligence are just arguments over meaningless words, because it is unlikely that salvation could depend on this kind of sophisticated understanding. But leave that aside. It is a matter of the utmost importance. If you take the position that Christ is like unto the Father, but a purely created being, the pagans can stand up and say, oh right, we're heading in the same direction. You see, you misunderstand us. We don't actually believe in Jupiter and Apollo and Athena and Aphrodite. We don't believe in the literal truth of these scandalous myths about the gods. We believe that there is a single unmoved mover, a divine being, and that these other gods are emanations from the one. When we offer prayers to Aphrodite, we are really offering prayers to the single supreme being. And so, yes, we'll come into the church and we'll offer prayers to Christ, and through Christ we'll offer prayers to the same supreme being, and therefore, why don't you come and join in a sacrifice in the temple of Apollo with us? If you accept the Aryan position that Christ is like unto the Father but created, it really puts Christ in the same position as the pagan gods. The church is not the sole path to salvation. The church is simply one path among many. One of the central claims of Christianity has always been that there is no salvation except through the church. Through which church, I suppose, is a matter of further investigation, but that is one of the central claims of Christianity. And to accept the Aryan position would, within a few years of the church's establishment, have short-circuited the revolution that it was trying to bring about. Christianity would have been the emperor's preferred faith, but it would simply have been a slightly more exclusive variant of the established pagan religion. And so this dispute divided the church. At first, Constantine tried to laugh it off, saying, "I'm the emperor, it's not my business to decide such issues." But the dispute spread and spread and spread, dividing the church into two camps, in some cases into two armed camps, until Constantine felt it necessary to call a council of the entire church to meet in Nicaea, a city outside Constantinople, indeed just across the water on the Asian side of the Straits. The emperor has summoned an ecumenical council of all the bishops from all the provinces of the empire. These bishops meet, they deliberate, they make a number of decisions, and these decisions are then given effect by the power of the state over which Constantine presides. The First Council of Nicaea decides that Christ is one with the Father, not like unto the Father. This is now the official position of the church and the official position of the state, for whatever that's worth. The merger that Constantine may have had in mind was that the church would become a department of state. The actual merger that took place was that, in large respect, the state was captured by the church. The church has co-opted all the intellectual classes, it has the support of the masses. The emperor suddenly finds that he is the head of a constitutional state. There is a further consequence which becomes much more important in the next century. Look at this top right picture. This is the Emperor Trajan around 100 AD. When when Octavian turned up in Egypt in late 30 BC to finish off Antony and Cleopatra, he found it convenient not to take Egypt into the empire as a province, but to make himself Pharaoh of Egypt. Once Cleopatra was dead, once she was out of the way, and her son Caesarion was out of the way, Augustus declared himself Pharaoh of Egypt, and that is how his successors continued. Egypt was their personal estate. It was not an official part of the empire. Because the emperor was the Pharaoh of Egypt, he was represented to his Egyptian subjects as a pharaoh in the traditional manner. What this means is that the ordinary people in Egypt, not the Greek-speaking people in Alexandria and many of the cities in the northern part of the country, but the traditional Egyptian population of the country, were of zero consequence. They were trapped, they were entombed in their own ancient religion, which meant that they were, as I said, of no consequence in the empire as a whole. There seems to have been no intellectual vitality among these people. In the 4th century, and Egypt came rather late into Christendom, but during the 4th century, Christianity made rapid progress, not in Alexandria, where it had taken over at a very early time, but in the Egyptian countryside. And by about 400, it seems that the majority of the Egyptian people, the native Egyptian people, had become Christians. But these Christians did not read the Bible in Greek. They read it in Coptic, and they did not feel bound by the theological formulations of Greek-speaking bishops in places like Alexandria or Antioch or Jerusalem or Constantinople. They had their own Coptic church, their own bishops, their own theology, their own translations of the liturgy. They had their own art, which is similar to that of the Greek Christian church, but it is not identical. You have a similar transformation in Syria. The Syriac peoples suddenly burst into intellectual life after 1,000 years of, so far as I can tell, complete silence. You have the sudden emergence of two new linguistic groups with their own literature. Let's call them nations. When I talk about their literature, until about 300 AD, there is nothing of any consequence in Coptic. Indeed, if a Coptic-speaking intellectual wants to write anything, if he didn't do it in Greek, he would write it in one of the ancient Egyptian scripts. But as soon as Egypt became Christian, Coptic acquired a new alphabet based on Greek. A large new literature flourished. This didn't seem terribly important in the reign of Constantine. It does become increasingly important as we move into the 5th century. What you have is an intellectually revitalized Egypt and Syria with their own conceptions of Christianity, and these move progressively further away from the Greek and the Roman mainstream. Constantine established Christianity perhaps as a way of unifying his empire. It seems first to have turned his empire into a constitutional state in which he and his successors were at a disadvantage, and also to have introduced various principles of division which had not previously existed and which might not otherwise have existed. But enough of Christianity. Let's talk about the final division and what we can call the emergence of the Byzantine Empire. Remember that Diocletian had experimented with divisions of the empire. It was too large and too much under pressure on its frontiers to be managed by a single man ruling from a single place. In 395, Theodosius the Great cements this century or so of experiments by dividing the empire into two halves. And this map shows the division. You've got the red half in the west and the purple half in the east. These divisions correspond roughly with the main linguistic division. And when I say the main linguistic, I must emphasize that Greek and Latin were the two official languages of the empire. They were not the majority languages. You could travel from city to city in the east, talking Greek in every city and expecting to be understood. The moment you stepped outside many of the cities, you found yourself in a countryside where people spoke something else. In the West, it was the same. It's just that in the West, it was possible for an Easterner speaking Greek to travel from city to city in the West and find somebody to communicate with him. Whereas if you travelled from the West to the East, you would find yourself in cities where people did not and would not speak Latin. But with that caveat, let me go back to what I'm saying. In 395, Theodosius I divided the empire into two administrative zones. These are not separate jurisdictions, they're not separate countries, they're not separate empires, that's what I want to say. It is the same empire, it's just that there are two administrative zones. There is the Eastern Zone with its capital in Constantinople, and there is the Western Zone with its capital in Rome, or sometimes Milan, but eventually Ravenna. The purpose of this in the short term was that Theodosius had two sons, Arcadius and Honorius, and he wanted one in the west, one in the east. Nothing wrong with that necessarily. This division also coincides with the real division of the empire into east and west. And this had far-reaching consequences. As I said, this is not a breakup of the empire. You have formal unity maintained. The emperors are related to each other. At first they're brothers and then they're cousins. When one emperor issues a law in, let's say, Constantinople, this is immediately posted off to Milan or Ravenna, where it is issued as a law with full credit in the West, and so it happens in the same way. But the most important division is this. Until 395, the taxes had been collected throughout the empire and spent by the empire to defend the empire, which meant increasingly that taxes were collected in that purple zone in the east and were then moved west to defend the Rhine and the Danube frontiers. The east paid a disproportionate share of the taxes, the west received a disproportionate share of government spending. That was in the nature of things. The east was more densely populated and it was more economically developed than the west. The west had longer and less easily defensible frontiers than the east. There was a continual movement of cash from the eastern provinces to the western provinces. After 395, this common taxation area, this common public spending area, came to an end. It meant that the taxes raised in the east were spent in the east, and the money spent in the west had to be raised in the west. It seems that the Western Empire was not populous enough and not rich enough to pay for its own defence. The West could not be defended without a continuing subsidy from the East. And that, I think, largely explains the different experiences of the Eastern and Western empires in the 5th century. It's not the case that Valentinian II was a worthless emperor who sold out Aetius, his great general. It's not the case that Stilicho, the great German military genius who could have saved the West, was sold out by a worthless emperor and his senatorial advisors. It's not a question of personalities. It is simply this. The West was not very densely populated. The West was not economically developed. It did not have enough population or enough economic development by itself to pay the costs of defending those long and continually pressed frontiers along the Rhine and Danube. Whereas the East had relatively defensible frontiers and a population and a level of economic development that made defending those frontiers a very easy business. And so look at the dates. In 395, the empire is divided into these two zones with separate treasuries and separate taxation and spending policies. In 406, a great confederation of barbarians crossed the Rhine. They were never driven out. They spread further and further through the western provinces, until within 50 years, nothing was left of the Western Empire except Italy, which itself was ruled effectively by barbarians. The barbarians had taken all of Gaul, they'd taken all of Spain, they'd taken all of North Africa. They were effectively in charge of Italy. The emperor ruled in Ravenna as a puppet of whatever barbarian warlord happened to be in the ascendant. Question: did the Eastern emperors provide no financial help to the Western emperors? His Eastern cousins would hand over quite large amounts of money to him as a subsidy, but the purpose of these subsidies was so that he could always have hot bath water. It was not supposed to pay for an army of defence. The reason the Western Empire collapsed so suddenly, and as seen at the time so unexpectedly, was because of that division of the treasuries in 395. The West was unable to afford its defence, and so the West was not defended, and because the West was not defended, the Western provinces fell. They became barbarian kingdoms, until eventually in 476 AD, the last Roman emperor in the West, a young man called Romulus Augustus, was deposed, and his imperial regalia were sent off to the emperor in Constantinople with a polite covering letter saying, "We don't actually need an emperor in the West anymore, so you'd better have these back." I suppose one further thing worth mentioning about the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustus, was that he wasn't led off to be executed by his barbarian captors. He was given a pension and sent off to live out the rest of his life. And it seems that he was still alive as late as about 520, so he lived quite a long time in retirement. But that is what happened to the West. As soon as the Eastern subsidies stopped flowing west, the Western Empire collapsed. What about the Eastern Empire? This is the divided empire. The West falls away into nothing, but the East carries on. It carries on, as I said, because it is rich enough to defend those entirely defensible frontiers. Its frontiers can be defended. The enemy to the east is the Persian Empire, which must be conciliated and occasionally must be fought against, but it is a civilized rival empire, and for most of the time it is possible to do business with these people. The northern frontiers, well, you've got the Black Sea, and as long as you control the Black Sea from a naval base, that's all right. That particular shore is safe. The Danube frontier, that's always a little soft, but with a few bribes you can usually move any barbarians who break across the Danube west. You give them a bribe and say, "Don't devastate our cities, go and do over Italy or somewhere. Here you are, go away, be off with you, here's some money." So the East was easily able to ride out the wave of invasions that finished off the Western Empire in the 5th century. Let's turn back to Constantinople. We have no figures, and so anyone who says by 500 the population of Constantinople was whatever, we don't know what it was. It may have been heading towards 1 million, but that's a guess, and we must always accept that this is a guess that can't be verified. But what we can say is that it has an excellent strategic and commercial location. It is easily able to control the Eastern Mediterranean. We can also trace its growth by looking at its defences. Have a look at this map of Constantinople. You have the Wall of Constantine, which was built in 330. And when Constantine founded the city, he went around its boundaries with a plough in the traditional way. Every so often his advisors would say, "Your Majesty, you're making a city much larger than anything we can imagine." Constantine's reply was, "I will stop when God tells me to." So Constantine establishes the city as something much larger than anybody else had imagined. And yet, within a century, the city has to be further expanded, or rather, within a century, the defensive walls must be expanded. The Wall of Constantine is taken down, and those parts which survive are allowed to fall into ruin. Instead, all defensive effort goes into the walls of Theodosius II, which remain impregnable until 1453. The Crusaders do break in 1204, but they don't get in through the long walls. They get in over the sea walls, which have not been properly maintained for a while. Those walls built in the reign of Theodosius II, those are vast and impregnable. looking at the growth of the area to be defended, we can see that the city is growing in size. It is at first a Latin-speaking city. Constantine is himself a native Latin speaker. The empire for centuries has been a Latin construct. Greek is, by convention, the official language in the East. But now there is a Latin city in the East, and it governs in Latin. So for a few centuries, for the first and only time before the Crusades, the Greek intellectual classes find it convenient to learn Latin. For the first few centuries of existence, Constantinople is a rather exotic place, a Latin island in a Greek-speaking sea. But it is, I suppose, like an ice cube in lukewarm water. It is gradually dissolving because, as a Latin island in a Greek sea, the Greeks are growing in numbers in Constantinople. Simple conservatism means that the laws are issued in Latin and the administration is conducted in Latin, but it is conducted by people whose first language is Greek. Increasingly, everything is translated into Greek and is only officially bilingual. It takes until the reign of Heraclius, starting in 610, for Latin to be abandoned as the official language, but long before then, Greek has effectively taken over as the language of the empire. And Greek does not only take over as the official language of the empire, it also increasingly becomes the language of the eastern provinces. What I said earlier was that the cities in the Eastern Empire were overwhelmingly Greek-speaking. This does not mean that Greek was spoken in the country districts where the great majority of people lived. Even until about 500, the majority of people in Asia Minor, or the territory of modern Turkey, were not familiar with Greek. It was not their language, or if they did know it, they didn't know it as a first language. It is because from about 450 onwards, the Church in both East and West takes a serious interest in the country districts and evangelizes them, and then imposes, in the West it's Latin, in the East it's Greek. France and Spain become Latin-speaking territories only after the collapse of the Western Empire. Before then they'd been largely Celtic-speaking outside the cities. But the important thing for the East is that by 500, the Eastern Empire has become a nation of Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians with Semitic appendages. The Semitic appendages are Egypt and Syria, but outside of those areas, in Greece and the territory of modern Turkey, what you have is the emergence of a Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian people who call themselves Romans. There is a representation of Constantinople in the later stages of its growth. Notice how it spread across the Golden Horn to the far shore, and sometimes there was a bridge across the Golden Horn. Sometimes there wasn't, of course. It is a large and wealthy city. I said last week that it may have been the second largest city in the world after Peking. Here are some representations of life in the Eastern Empire in the 5th century, a time which in the West saw the complete disappearance of imperial rule. It didn't see the destruction of Roman civilization in the West, but it was a time of rapid change in the West. But in the East, everything carried on as before. Indeed, because it was now possible to cut taxes, no longer having to pay for Western defence, things didn't simply carry on much as before, they carried on better than before. It seems that populations were rising, agricultural output was rising, cities were expanding in numbers and in magnificence, and you can see the results in the surviving artifacts. There's an interesting representation of a musical performance of some kind in the 5th century. Notice that for the first time those boys are wearing knickers. In the pagan empire they wouldn't have bothered with clothes, but in the Christian empire some kind of public respectability was expected. Again, representations of life in the Eastern Empire. I think that wheeled object is something to do with surveying, but don't ask me what it is. So, life in the 5th century, we're supposed to see it as an age of Western collapse, and in the political sense it is, but in the East it is a pretty glorious time to be alive. Perhaps the best time in the whole of antiquity to be alive was in the eastern provinces of the empire during the 5th century. There is the Hippodrome of Constantinople, built in the 5th century, able to hold, I think, about 150,000 people. There is a relief from the wall of the Hippodrome. There is the Forum of Constantine, a reconstruction of it. The city was built from almost nothing, but within a century it had easily outstripped Rome in size and wealth and external magnificence. And there is what keeps Constantinople safe. Those land walls, these multiple lines of defence which no enemy ever got across. On the far right you have a low retaining wall. If you get over that, you fall headfirst into the moat. If you can get across the moat, you have the outermost line of the walled defences. If you manage to get onto those, you've got 2 further lines of defences. So far as I can tell, nobody ever managed to get across the moat. What you have on the high points of the walls is a great mass of spring-loaded artillery. If you look at some of the reconstructions on YouTube, you'll see that this spring-loaded artillery, various kinds of catapult, spring-loaded bows for projecting large arrows, are just as deadly over much the same range as gunpowder-based artillery in the 15th and 16th centuries. I think the reason why gunpowder-based artillery took over is that it's simpler technology, it's more portable, and it's cheaper to produce. You shouldn't despise the kind of defensive artillery that was available in the ancient world. But this is what keeps Constantinople safe. This is what allows that glorious life to go on inside the imperial capital, that whatever else is going on in the world outside, Constantinople is absolutely impregnable. And because the imperial capital is absolutely impregnable, it means that the empire itself is secure. You can't say that of the West, but because Constantinople occupies that critical position at the juncture of East and West, it is itself part of the defence of the empire. It means that an enemy coming from the West will not be able to get into the eastern provinces, and an enemy coming from the east will not be able to get into the western provinces. In order to move from one side of the Eastern Empire to the other, you've got to get through Constantinople, and Constantinople is absolutely impregnable. And there is also the fact that Constantinople is so vastly wealthy and so easily able to dominate the seas that it is the defence of the empire for 1,000 years to come. And that's all I have to say about that for the moment. Was that all right?
Yes.
Well, thank you. So, any questions? A long and searching question. I have described the West as a parasitic appendage of the East. However, the empire had been conquered by Western armies that could absorb losses of 100,000 men in the Punic Wars. So what has happened in the interim to make the West into a demographic nullity, something on a kind of welfare from the East until it finally collapses? We don't have any statistics, and so it is very difficult to give a precise answer. However, when you mention that during the First and Second Punic Wars, Rome was able to absorb vast losses of men, you must bear in mind that at the time Rome was defending Italy. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Western Roman state is not defending Italy, it is defending the whole of Western Europe south of the Rhine. It seems that its resources, even if we assume that its human resources had not diminished in number since the Punic Wars, the expanded frontiers are just too large to defend. As far as Western power is concerned, it seems that Rome was able to conquer the East from the 2nd century BC onwards because the East was politically divided and its undeniably immense resources were not effectively used by the various governments ruling in the East. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the East was part of the Roman Empire. It was efficiently ruled and its resources were efficiently put to the use of the state. And so that would largely explain the difference. The West had expanded from the Alps to the Rhine and the Danube and the North Sea by the 5th century, and the Western Empire on its own just wasn't rich enough to maintain those frontiers. It would be useful if we could say that populations had fallen since the middle of the 2nd century. It is possible that they had, but there is no way of telling that. It may be that populations fell and then recovered, we just don't know. But for whatever reason, by the end of the 4th century, the Western provinces were, as you say, a parasitic appendage. The division of the empire was an immediate benefit for the East. It was possible for the emperors to reduce and in some cases to abolish taxes, whereas in the West it was simply not possible to raise enough money or sufficiently large armies to maintain an efficient defence of the Rhine frontier. Once you have a divided empire, then there is an immediate temptation for the Eastern government, being flush with cash, to look at barbarians who break across the Danube and to say, here is some money, indeed here is a very large amount of money, why don't you go west? There is Italy, there are the Western provinces, go and despoil those, leave us alone. That is what they did to the Goths under Alaric, and that's what they did to the Huns under Attila. There are some modern historians, well, Gibbon I suppose, who regard the subsidy diplomacy of the Eastern Empire as a rather ignoble thing, a rather cowardly thing to undertake. But why bother getting into a war which you might not win, or which might involve you in all manner of unpredictable embarrassments, when you can just take half a ton of gold coins and heap them up at the feet of some tattooed savage who will nod and smile and turn about and go in the other direction? That's a calculation made by the Eastern emperors in the 5th centuries, and it does not seem to have been at all to the disadvantage of the Eastern taxpayers or the Eastern peoples in general. a question about the importance of Egypt to the Eastern Empire after the 395 division. Was Egypt still important? It must be important. It must be of enormous importance. The problem is we don't know what's going on. I can tell you what happened. In 615, the Persians took Egypt from the empire, and they held on to it for 13 years until 628, when, after the total obliteration of the Persian Empire, Egypt was returned. And then it remained in the empire for another 10 years or so until the Arabs turned up and took it, this time finally. You would expect that the loss of Egypt in 618, I think it was, yes, the loss of Egypt in 618 had been a hammer blow to the Eastern Empire, and that it would be thrown into an immediate crisis. And there is no evidence that it was, no evidence at all. The free bread distributions were ended in Constantinople and never resumed. There doesn't appear to have been any rioting. There's no evidence of mass starvation. The empire lost Egypt and doesn't appear to have missed it in any possible sense. That may be because the plagues had reduced the populations of the East so much that Egyptian grain was superfluous. It may be that other closer sources of grain in the southern Ukraine, for example, were now being exploited. We don't know, but it does seem that the loss of Egypt and Syria were of absolutely no consequence to the empire in the 7th century, and we don't know why that was. But yes, Egypt sent, I think, 7 million bushels of corn to Rome every year, and then the same amount to Constantinople, and this was of enormous importance. But at some point in the 6th or maybe the early 7th century, it stopped being important, and I don't know why. But you see, although we know a great deal more about the Byzantine Empire, or we know more about late antiquity than we know about the end of the Bronze Age, there are still many things that we don't know, and something we don't know is population statistics and trading patterns. We can look at them, we can uncover them indirectly, but it's not the same as being able to look at things as we can since about 1350, let's say. Anyway, next week I want to talk about Justinian's attempted reconquest of the West. I think I want to talk about that. I certainly want to talk about what happened in the 5th century in the East. I'll get these slides together and I'll send them out to you, and I'll see you next week. So